you kill the video.
Has joined the meeting.
Mike Gerasi
has joined the meeting.
Under Sheriff Barrett, Schenectady County Sheriff's Office.
Has joined the meeting. A participant has joined the meeting.
Schenectady Sheriff Superintendent Ronald Walsh
has joined the meeting.
And even though the screen says Brian Gray, it's I did that. Then automatically.
Schenectady County Sheriff's Office, Chief Deputy John Lubram.
Has joined the meeting.
Yeah.
Can we just turn the whole meeting? Yeah, I know. Does that work for you?
We'll wait just another minute to give people a chance to join in, and we'll start.
Has joined the meeting.
Hey, folks, this is Genghis.
I want to thank everybody for again joining us this afternoon. I want to especially thank Drs. McLean and Morden from the Finn Institute for the work that they've put together and the report that they put out the day before yesterday and was shared with the committee yesterday. It's 113 pages, give or take a couple. There's a lot of information there. Don't expect everybody to have been able to review it in the last 24 hours, but would appreciate people going through it. Again, seeing how it fits into our overall discussion, some of the recommendations that are made, some of the general information that educates all of us in terms of best practices and goals that we should have collectively as a community. With that, I'm going to turn over to Chief Clifford to kind of run this meeting and go through the agenda.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. We have two items on the agenda today. I'm going to take the first couple minutes and talk about the Finn Institute report, and then I'm going to turn it over to Michaela Foster, who's going to go through the 13 demands, and we're going to have a discussion about them. We did receive the Finn Institute report earlier this week, and it was shared with everybody. We do understand that it's 113 pages long, about 66 pages of reading. The rest of it is a part of the survey and results. Just to give everybody a baseline of what the difference is between this report that we just received and what we're working on here at the Schenectady Police Department. The Finn Institute was brought in as our research partner, and their role was to gather information about the SPD's deployments, strategies, policies, procedures, and practices. This was in line with what the governor's executive order asked for. And then their additional roles was to assess them against the base of social scientific evidence. Their report is very comprehensive. It really does capture the emerging themes that came out of our conversation. And what they did was they did a really good job with assessing them against existing empirical evidence and research that's been done, and a lot of best practices that are being done throughout the country. They included references to our community conversation specifically, and in some cases they added recommendations within the reading. So please take the time to read that. We'll have a very thorough conversation about that next Wednesday on the 3rd. That will be the plan, is to review the Fin Institute report and pay particular attention to page 63 of this report. That's where they talk about implications, and those implications are really going to be where a lot of our recommendations are going to be derived from. There's a number of implications, and in almost every recommendation is going to be, we're going to be able to point back to that implication. The implications were all derived from the conversations. The report that we're working on, we're going to write a supplemental report. So our report will have the executive summary, and we will be outlining certain things that are not included in the Fin report, but will have recommendations attached to them. So we wanted to make sure that if we recommend something, that we provide a basis of what we're currently doing, so that you could see that this is why we're recommending what we're recommending. So we hope to have that done and in the hands of everybody by the end of business Friday. That's our goal. If we can get it done sooner, we will, but our goal is to get it done by Friday. Once we get that into the hands of the steering committee and we have this conversation on next Wednesday, we'll be open to feedback from the steering committee as it relates to the whole process, and even as it relates to recommendations that are included. We're then going to send it on to the city council, hopefully later on the day Wednesday, get it in their hands. It's not going to prevent the steering committee from participating in public input on the 8th, or even getting recommendations to us that you'd like to be added for the city council to consider. Just that, trying to stay on this timeline. We want to be able to get it in the hands of city council. What we plan on giving them will be the Fin report, SPD's report, and the appendices, which is all the documents generated as a result of this collaborative that we've put together. That's all I have on that. I'm not even going to open it up to questions. We can get to them at the end of the hour, or when we're done with talking about the 13 demands. I want to turn it over to Michaela to begin, and we are here to support and show anything on the screen that you may need assistance with. Michaela, just let us know if you want us to put anything up, or if you will be doing it yourself, if you need permissions for that.
So can you or Carissa give me the permissions to share my screen, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Michaela, I just made you a presenter, so you should be able to share your screen now.
One second, just trying to, it won't allow me to share it too. Just give me 1 second. I'm attempting to share my screen, but if it won't allow me to, we're going to download and send the presentation to you, Carissa, so you would be able to share your screen. Just give me 1 minute, please.
Yeah, I'm on
I
mute.
didn't leave no gloves in here, did I?
No, sir.
Okay.
No.
Michaela, you're trying to bring up the demands document, right? Of the
the series of documents that were sent, you're bringing up the demands?
No, we have
The annotated version of the demands?
we have a presentation, as well as those. So I'm trying to share the screen. We just sent it over to you, Carissa. If you could just share your screen with the presentation, and then we will do something over it.
Next.
Carissa, did you get the email that has the presentation?
Yep, I just got it. I'm going to share it right now.
Thank
Okay.
you. All right.
All right, thank you. So everyone should see the screen, and then if you hit present, you can just, I'll say next slide when we're ready to go to the next slide. So obviously this conversation today is about the 13 demands that were created by all of us to end police brutality, state-sanctioned violence, and abuse of power. Go ahead, next slide, Carissa. It was February 15th, 2020 that I launched All of Us on Facebook. That's actually the original logo. For those that don't know, my name is Jamaica Miles, and the founder of All of Us, which started here in the city of Schenectady back on February 15th, 2020. And shortly thereafter was joined by co-founder Sean Young. Both of us being born and raised in the city of Schenectady and having extensive knowledge and personal experience in the local communities of Hamilton Hill and Mount Pleasant and most of the marginalized and poorer communities, we began having additional conversations in addition to what had already been had, as I myself have been doing advocacy and organizing work in the city of Schenectady for more than 7 years. Next slide. So one of the first intentional conversations was around International Women's Day, where a group of women came together to talk about what is it that we saw in the city of Schenectady and what were our concerns and what did we want to learn. But it wasn't the only conversation, because at every action, at every event, whether it was called a community conversation or if it was calls actually to people in the community, because we actually made phone calls to individuals in the community, it was always about what are the concerns that individuals have? What are their worries? What do they think would make their lives better? Whether it was specifically about policing or not, their safety and well-being was a topic of discussion for all of those discussions. Next slide. And because of those conversations and the lived experience of myself and others, including those who became members of the core leadership team, we came up with the 13 demands, which were emailed to the mayor and also part of a launch that were on the steps of City Hall on Thursday, June 11th, where we read out loud what those 13 demands were, and also had, like I said, shared them with the mayor. Next slide, please.
We also took those the same day on June 11th to the police department and did the same thing.
Yeah, those demands have been everywhere. There's no shortage, but because we're very intentional about our work and lifting up the voices of impacted people who have the most knowledge and access to what needs to be changed, we also wanted to get additional feedback. So on June 14th, this is a screenshot from the All of Us Facebook page. We actually launched a campaign that was also online and in person to get feedback. These are the 13 demands. Do you agree with them? If so, sign this petition. Individuals put their name, their zip code, their email address, and their phone number. Their email address and their phone number was not mandatory. We simply needed their first name, last name, and zip code. And when we were in person, we also collected that information. Here's the 13 demands. If you agree with this, go ahead and put your information on here. As you can see, that post had 70 shares and only 6 comments, but quite a few reactions that were all positive. Next screen, please. Now, after that, as we continued to collect support for the 13 demands as they were written and additional feedback to make sure we had further reflections, we ended up with 548 petition signatures specific to Schenectady that we sent to the city council and the mayor on July 27th. It's actually a part of the city council record. Unfortunately, that city council meeting was muted. A number of us participated watching the city council meeting, putting messages in the chat saying, we can't hear you. No one heard live them mention the petition signatures, or that there were, I believe it was 48 emails that also went in that same day. But that information is included in the agenda minutes for that city council meeting, which can be found online and was also provided in the email. There's a direct link to those minutes. You can see that it's in the minutes that the petition signatures for Schenectady were submitted to the city council and the mayor on July 27th and are part of public record. Next slide, please. But it didn't stop there. Just because we had 548 signatures didn't mean that the work was done, because we knew there were more voices to hear, more people to listen to, and we wanted to be sure that our language was going to be consistent with ending police brutality, state-sanctioned violence, and abuse of power, that we didn't want to perpetuate the systems and structures that were already causing harm. So this is just a small sample of some of the places that we showed up in the city of Schenectady. But I also want to point out to you that there are times that we're not in the city of Schenectady, but we talk to people from the city of Schenectady. We've been in Troy, Albany, Saratoga, and had people from Schenectady at those events and actions as well. And in the reverse, there are people that may not live in Schenectady, but have been in Schenectady for business or for pleasure or visiting people that also have comments and concerns about the city of Schenectady. And included in the email is actually a PDF of all of the actions and activities that happened in 2020 through all of us that elicited comments and concerns. Next slide, please. But hey, let's jump right to the 13 demands that got a whole 5 minutes from the chief of police when he gave his presentation. The first statement inside the 13 demands is actually incredibly important because it reads, elected and city officials will put forward an anti-racist, community-driven agenda that includes an acknowledgement of the bias within the previous and current system and will express a commitment to repairing the harm perpetrated on Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other marginalized individuals. This agenda shall include a commitment from officials to implement changes possible within their powers of their office, as well as a commitment to advocate for changes in other areas outside of that power that have an impact on racial justice in the locality. The point being that if the power is not directly within your office, but you have a commitment to anti-racism, equity, and justice, then you will be an advocate for making sure that change happens outside of your office. Next slide, please. The first demand, anyone that's followed all of us or seen the first iteration of these demands, this is one of the places that the language changed. In the original 13 demands, it says, we demand prosecution, but we recognize that as harmful language, and it doesn't align with the principles and ideology of ending police brutality. So it was changed to read, we demand accountability for all law enforcement and corrections officers, because this isn't just about the police officers in our streets. I'm glad to know that there's someone from the sheriff's office on this call, because it is also about the brutality that happens behind the wall in the county jail. But let's get to the details. Law enforcement and corrections officers should be held accountable when they are responsible for causing harm to individuals within the community. This should include suspension without pay and the possibility of the loss of certification. Elected representatives and city officials should expect and actively advocate for accountability when harm befalls an individual within a locality, regardless of the occupation of the accused. That's important because we know that poor folks happen to receive disproportionate abuse from police, and more so if they're Black and brown. So it's not just to say that there needs to be accountability, but it does even list in the annotated version what that accountability should look like, and it's not something we've seen before. Next slide, please. Diversion back to the community of all assets seized by law enforcement. If anyone wants to dig in on this, I'm sure it's rife with conversation and lots of debate. But the point being that if at some point the DA's office happened to receive money over seizures and said, I'm going to give this money to the police department, that the police department could say, we don't want that money. We want it to actually go to community focused services and harm reduction and restorative practices, not to our department. But actually advocating for, again, right, that even if it is not within your control, that you would advocate for it to be community centered and offer those support services directly to the community. Next slide, please. Number 3 and number 4, automatic firing for all racist texts, emails, letters, social media posts, phone calls, and so-called private conversations by any law enforcement officer or corrections officer. No individual who expresses racist bias will be tolerated to work as a law enforcement officer or any kind, nor a corrections officer. Removal of any and all certification should be immediate, as well as removal from their duties and position. This is actually in line with what we're seeing nationally to remove extremists from law enforcement positions. We most recently saw a push for that when it came to the insurrection at the state capitol. Number 4, a process of community response review. Now, this is something that would mean creating something new, that a body would have the power to make recommendations about living while Black hate crimes for private residents who commit these crimes and the police who attempt to enforce them. So let's say somebody makes a phone call because Black children are selling water on a corner and the police show up to investigate it. The individual who was perpetuating this harm would receive some type of summons to be a part of a community response review that would have recommendations for restitution. Yeah, it means creating a new body where a community has agency over themselves and allows for that type of restorative practice. Next slide, please. Automatic firing for intentionally disengaged or intentionally damaged body cams. Any individual who has a body cam which is intentionally disengaged or intentionally damaged, resulting in unavailable video footage of their interaction, shall have the removal of any and all certification, as well as their removal from their duties and position. Again, the language repeats because it is about the accountability that when harm is caused or there is this type of infraction, that it is seen for the public what that accountability looks like, whether it is their certification completely or if it starts with their duties and their position. Number 6 being the abolition of all no-knock warrants. Again, whether it is within your duty to do so or not, that you advocate for the abolition of no-knock warrants, which we actually have seen happen, that it does exist in this country, that no-knock warrants have been eliminated. Next slide, please. Number 9, which is one that we actually believed was going to be the low bar, that it would be easy for this to happen, but unfortunately, we all know what happened to Yugurshwar after these demands had already been released. The abolition.
Jamaica, I apologize to interrupt. We're just missing
7 and 8.
7 and 8.
Oh,
We have them.
I'll go back and go over those after. Yeah, I didn't notice that slide was missing. Thank you. So we'll skip ahead to number 9. We'll go back for 7 and 8. Number 9, the abolition of all chokeholds, strangleholds, and hog ties for all law enforcement and correction officers inside detention centers, jails, and prisons. Again, these demands were put out prior to the knee on the neck of Yogeshwar, which happened in the city of Schenectady. There were also other accounts of this where people had posted on social media. These demands came out before that incident. So had there been an abolition of all chokeholds, strangleholds, knee holds, and hog ties for law enforcement, then maybe that might not have happened. Number 10, ban shooting at moving vehicles. Whether it is currently used or not, the explicit policy of not discharging a weapon at a moving vehicle to be written, as well as a plan for implementation and training for all individuals to ensure their understanding and consequences of losing certification and position if they are used. The training and implementation is critical, especially for 9 and 10, because it's not enough simply to say we're going to write this into the policy, but also what is the plan to make sure that it happens. Next slide, please. Number 11, which actually relates directly to the Civilian Police Review Board. Require all use of force interactions to be reported with racial data for both the law enforcement officer or correction officer and the injured party. The Civilian Review Board will have full access to the racial data, unredacted files of the officer, and any other evidence, as well as subpoena and disciplinary power, and the power to submit to the Attorney General for further review and investigation. Now, this was written before the repeal of 50A, but then we still had to live through a lawsuit to prove that the repeal of 50A applied to the officers in Schenectady. But specifically in the annotated part, right? Because the annotations give that additional detail that were left out of the chief's PowerPoint presentation. Interactions between law enforcement officers or correctional officers and individuals which results in an injury of any kind should include a report which captures the racial information of all parties involved. An injury is one that is visible as well as expressed by the injured party or any third party and should receive immediate medical assessment and attention prior to any processing for accused legal infractions. All interactions should be reviewed by a civilian review board, separate from any internal review, and should go directly to the board without requisite review by anyone within the police department. The Civilian Review Board would be presented with the history of the officer, including previous interactions that resulted in injury or accusations against the officer. The Civilian Review Board should have subpoena power, disciplinary power, and explicit access to submit the interaction to the Attorney General for further review and investigation of the law enforcement or correction officer. Additionally, this would require the creation of a Civilian Review Board specific to the interactions involving corrections officers. This is a big one that involves the Civilian Police Review Board and is currently being discussed, and would have made all the world of difference to Andrew Kearse that took 3 years for an apology, and that's all his widow got. Next slide, please. Anti-racism training for all persons working for law enforcement and detention facilities, including but not limited to jails, prisons, and juvenile detentions. Anti-racism training and anti-bias training are not the same things. They're not. Anti-racism training should be required for all personnel within law enforcement and detention facilities with a minimum of an annual certification to be completed. Anti-racism trainings, when they are done well, understand that it's not just about race. It is a conversation that looks at all forms of oppression, exploitation, and othering that happens and allows for individuals to not just look at the interpersonal interactions, but the systems and structures, and then ways to apply that knowledge to end the culture and environment of racism. Next slide, please. 13, the big, long demilitarize law enforcement and defund law enforcement agencies, with those funds being reallocated to community-based restorative groups for conflict resolution and restorative practices and other community-based programs, services, and solutions. When we say defund the police, we actually mean defund the police. We mean take from the police part of their budget and use that money directly for community services and programs that would actually directly impact the issues of poverty, healthcare, jobs, training, and end those issues that end up getting criminalized. Because if we end homelessness, then we don't have to worry about the police harassing people for sleeping in the park, which was part of the feedback we received, that individuals who are homeless are harassed by the police. So we don't need police to harass the homeless. We need more homeless shelters. We need more programs that help with job training and opportunity. Demilitarizing law enforcement means restricting law enforcement and police departments from all of the things listed on the screen. It should not be that we have the military in our communities. It is already an issue with over-policing in our poorest communities. We don't need to have the military there as well. The two that were not listed on the screen, and my apologies that we missed, 7 and 8. 7 was the end of all ticket writing incentive programs, speed trap schemes, parking violations, and traffic stops for petty violations, to make sure that localities are not building their budgets on the backs of poor and working people, nor target the communities already suffering the greatest economic struggle. This includes not having a quota for tickets written, not having parking violations assessed on the most vulnerable areas of a locality, because when cars are towed and you didn't have money to pay for the tow truck, it then gets compounded. If you live in a community that's impoverished, but the parking is not available, and how could we better use the police that already exist to ensure there are not parking violations, that people are able to move their cars? Number 8, which I believe actually is one that already does exist, so that's great, is that all sobriety tests be recorded. So all sobriety tests should be recorded, as should all interactions. It is my understanding that officers have body cams, and so that would mean that any interaction would be recorded. I don't know if that actually is also true for undercover detective type people, but that's not actually in our 13 demands. Next slide, please. I want to say that one of the reasons I read through everything is because I did notice that there are some people who are not on video that they called in. So there are individuals that cannot see the screen. So I want to make sure that there is full inclusivity, that anyone that is calling in also is able to hear what many of us are looking at on the screen. And this final slide is specific to all of us as an organization. We are a Black-led grassroots community organization fighting for Black liberation and an end to all forms of racism, oppression, and exploitation. We are committed to a strategy that prioritizes the voices of the marginalized in localities across the greater capital region of New York, building towards change within New York State as a whole. All of us make space for conversations that unite people across differences, invest in the leadership development of local communities, especially of its youth, and works in coalition with other groups. The one thing that's not on this slide that I cannot say enough, this group started here in the city of Schenectady, my home, where I was born and raised, grew up on Hamilton Hill, and I'm never leaving. So if there are questions, comments, concerns about the timeline or the process by which we came up with this information, which I don't believe other organizations from the community were asked to provide, and nor should they. We should not ask local community organizations that do the work and work hand in hand with the community members how they get the information, because we're trusted messengers that work directly with individuals every single day. And so it is very disrespectful and a bit degrading to feel as if I have to validate the work that has been happening, not just over the last year with this organization, but the work that I myself have been doing in the city of Schenectady pretty much a decade.
And the lived experiences of people who work within this organization, myself included, and the people who we've collected these stories from. That's the idea of community conversation, as well as protest. When we protest, we have these conversations, people show up and they express something, and we don't just sit and chant the entire time. We have people who come up and speak, and it's not just people from all of us. And we've had these in public facilities. We've had them outside the mayor's office in the city hall. We've had them outside the police station. We've been transparent about how and when and for what we show up, because people are living these experiences and don't always have the agency or ability to share these experiences with a steering committee that they hardly know about. I mean, the difference between something happening and people knowing that it's happening is vast, especially in marginalized communities who have a history of oppression and distrust towards these systems and structures that are in place. And that's the point of a steering committee like this, to listen to as many community voices as possible, to include as much equity as possible in listening to those voices, because those voices aren't going to tell you a lie. They're going to tell you what they've lived through. And that's the importance. And that's where the 13 demands originally came from and how they continue to come. We've had these conversations not only centric to Schenectady, but like Jamaica said, all over the district. And we've gone to support because people are living these experiences, people of color, trans people, queer people, myself included, and people who don't fall under these different marginalized categories. These are people from all over Schenectady. We have white people, we have Christian people, we have people who aren't the first thing you think of when you think of police brutality, unfortunately, signing these petitions because they live it too. And that's the importance of this. So
one thing I forgot to mention that when questioned about the validity of the petitions and the 13 demands, I then went back to look at the online petition. That's still live. It's there. And since the petition was delivered to the city back in July, we've gotten another 286 signatures, in addition to the more than 500 we had already received. So yeah, it continues to grow. I don't know how many survey responses you received for the survey that you put out, but we now are looking at more than 800.
Just for Schenectady.
For Schenectady.
There's Saratoga, Albany, Troy, etc. as well, that we haven't included because obviously this is specific to Schenectady. But those people are listening as well, and those people feel the same way. And that is ultimately the point. They're having steering committees over in those areas and localities as well. And these same ideas are being put forth and oftentimes silenced.
Questions from anyone that's on this call?
So Michaela and Jamaica, thank you very much. I just wanted to make a comment since, I was a key part of the discussion last Wednesday. It is for all the reasons that you cited that I felt, and I'm speaking for myself here, and, Reverend Groovesby can speak up, that the 13 demands as they were written, annotated version, whatever the latest version was, should have been included as an appendix, clear to find, easy to find in whatever the task force puts forward. And I'm actually glad that the chief had, said, let's have this discussion. I'm glad it's happening today so that the rest of the task force has a chance to, since we're all here, give their comments and considerations. I'm still going to hold with that recommendation that the 13 demands as written should be included in the for a matter of completeness and representing the community voice in whatever final reports go forward. I just wanted to, make that clear. But, I would like, obviously, beyond that, everything you've informed us on here today that I'm hoping people have been aware of, that we could have some key discussions in the time that's left.
Yes, if I could, hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, if I could add to that, thanks for the lead-in, Cengiz. I would second that. I originally raised it because because I believe such a critical part of the community context in which we're operating. I mean, I appreciate all the other work that's been done, but I appreciate this presentation and also the shifting the agenda so this could proceed. I believe that what's presented in a summary fashion can readily go into the final report, as I indicated, even not just as an appendix, but really it's right after what the governor is requesting because it's our community context. And whether, I think we'll have different points of agreement or disagreement on particular items, but I believe, and that's not really the concern. My concern primarily is a process one that would be included in and therefore part of the fuller conversation for what we're about. And just believe that's critically important. So thanks for the work you guys have done on the presentation. And I think any kind of summary, and I saw Jamaica had sent out even a shorter summary as an email, I think it was today or yesterday, which just has 3 or 4 paragraphs and dates, and that kind of thing could readily go before the demands, but it'd be important to have not only demands themselves, but the amendment, the annotations, I guess you want to call them, to go on them to explain them further. But I think it's just critically important to be in the document. Thanks.
Yeah, the email includes some dates that we didn't mention in the presentation, including the conversation that myself, Michaela, and Sean Young had with the mayor, the chief of police, and some other police members that we weren't expecting on the call that was hosted by faith leaders, because that did happen too.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I do want to uplift and second the focus on including the 13 demands and our provided timeline as a part of the report. Of course, there has been and there will continue to be discourse on how to meet these demands, whether or not people in law enforcement support them, and so on. But regardless of that conversation, and obviously we wrote them, we know where we stand on it, but regardless of that conversation, having the 13 demands and the proof that they happened and that community members spoke up for an entire year, and still, because this is still an active campaign and people are still doing this and things are still happening, and we're still pushing for justice in Schenectady, but including that specific timeline within 2020, before and during Cuomo's executive order, is important because that is the largest collection of community voices in compilation format that we have right now in the city of Schenectady. If there's any other collection of stories and voices as public, as openly discussed, as transparent, and as on the ground with community members, I would love to see it. But this is this is what we have from community members. I mean, the steering committee is what it is and it's important, but not everyone knows about it, but a lot of people know about the 13 demands, and that ties directly into the integrity of the steering committee. It's about ending police brutality, both of those things. So that's why I personally feel like, if I wasn't in all of us, had I not had a part in pushing these out, my genuine feeling on the matter as a Black, Indigenous, and trans person in Schenectady would be, this is something that I put my hand on. This is something that I speak to, and this is my voice, and this is the voice of people like me and not like me who are most marginalized. And that's where these stories, voices, and annotations come from. And I think that's why it's important to include it as something that can be referenced, looked at, and seen publicly and openly, because that's how the process was done, publicly, openly, and transparently.
Right.
Any other questions?
Yes. Can I just make a comment? I'll put my video on because that's like rude not to have my face while I'm talking. All right. Hi, it's Mary in Porterfield. So first of all, I want to thank you for actually giving the presentation. I found it very beneficial. And I also want to offer my thanks for the annotated version of it, because to me that spoke to the fact that you saw there was some language in there that even for it was the opposite of what you were fighting against. You were using the type of language that you were fighting against. So I appreciate the fact that you recognize that and that you changed the language. That to me means it's an organization who's willing to take a look at what we're doing and how we need to improve what we're doing. And does it flow with with our actual vision and mission is. So I want to tell you, thank you for that. And I also just wanted to comment, I think it was number 5, where you talked about a community accountability. And just a little history. There used to be something called the Community Accountability Board through the, it used to be Law, Order, and Justice. And so that may be a model that we could do something similar to that to talk about the community accountability. So I just wanted to offer that. I know we're short on time, so I'll just leave it with those couple of things. So thanks again for presenting that and taking the time to explain it. I think that for me anyway, it even gave a little bit more clarity and definition. Thanks.
Thanks. So I think Councilwoman Porterfield, I think when the City Council discusses these, right, and discusses all the recommendations coming out of, you know, what we learning from the demands, what we have from the survey, what we have from the community conversations, which hopefully we'll discuss next week. Remembering the CAB is probably a good thing to bring up at that point, right? It could be a policy, an implementation that we might need to relook at.
Because we are looking
right?
for community restorative practices, right? Community conflict resolution. That don't involve law enforcement, that are trained, paid positions that individuals would be, you know, have agency over their communities. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I was really, one of the pieces that really stuck out to me today was the invitation to expand accountability beyond a person's very specific scope. And I know the Schenectady that I want to live in is one where people attend to any anti-racist practices, anti-oppression practices within their own scope of influence, but also to be able to care and reflect on where those happen outside. If I'm at the grocery store, that's my area of responsibility, but I still want to be able to speak up if I see something happen, because that's the kind of community that, and so I just noticed that today and I appreciated that. I would also just like to invite us all to recognize that today is a tender day to be having this conversation after the announcement that came out from Rochester, and that whether you're here as a police officer who may be feeling vulnerable after that announcement, or people who are feeling angry after that announcement, that it's hard to have an open-minded conversation from a place of any of those kinds of strong feelings that are coming up. And so I'm appreciating the willingness of people who are here today.
Any other questions or comments as it relates to the 13 demands? I will just say, I was surprised to see there are so many cops on this call, that the very institution that didn't think it needed to change at all had so much representation compared to the community. That this was supposed to be a steering committee about change, but it has so many cops.
Hi, I got one quick question. Could you follow up with an email later with maybe some of the groups that helped you form the 13 demands? So, because
No, that is us. We're
just
us, all of us.
I understand that, but at the end you talked about some of the groups that maybe didn't have a voice, and that way we could hopefully reach out to them to prevent that from happening in the future.
So the creation of the 13 demands is specifically like within
I think
creating them.
when you said the voice of
all the voices of the community
of groups not heard.
My understanding was that you were talking about like who
actual organizations.
Yeah, no. So within the 13 demands, in how they were created. They were created by having community conversations in which everybody was invited to, the entire community. And they did not just take place with Black people and so on and so on, although we do prioritize those most marginalized because you have to start change with those who are most affected by it. However,
the groups that you're speaking of, if I were to sit here and try to create a list for you, Black people, white people, trans people, people differently abled, Latinx people, immigrant people, indigenous people, homeless people, people of faith, agnostic people, atheist people, all of the different groups and intersections that you can imagine live in the city of Schenectady. I don't think there is anyone that we didn't hear from, but the largest group were those most impacted by the negative practices of policing. As for groups and organizations, there were groups that actually signed on in support of the 13 demands.
Including Vocal New York.
Vocal New York signed in support. So did Troy Sanctuary and Ice Free Ice Free Capital District, who are immigrant community based organizations. So there were other organizations that said, yes, we support this, and those are posted and shared on Facebook when that happened.
But as for the creation, we as an organization, and let's speak to that really quickly as well, because it wasn't completely included, although it's known that we're Black led. Everybody in the core leadership team of all of us identifies as Black or African American with intersections, obviously. However, we are also differently abled, come from different class, economic backgrounds. We come from, me and two other members are trans or non-binary. There are people who come from different national backgrounds and so on and so forth. We, as an organization, are intersectional intentionally. However, we work to intentionally broaden that in speaking to everyone. Being Black led doesn't mean that we don't talk to people who are not Black, because people are affected regardless of that. It's just we prioritize and maintain a constant presence in listening to those most marginalized, but we go down that entire list intentionally and reach out. Even when people aren't reaching for us, we reach out to them to maintain that this is as inclusive, intersecting, and transparent as possible. Because why bring forth saying, even though we're all community members, we all live in Schenectady and experience Schenectady. I've experienced police brutality. People in the All of Us team have experienced incarceration in Schenectady. People having endured so many things in Schenectady, but to make sure that we are pushing forth the best possible work, the best possible compilation of voices and stories and lived experiences, we pushed ourselves out of our own comfort levels and asked people to push themselves as well. Talk about the honest truth. People don't trust police, but people might not trust us walking around in Schenectady either. And that was the point, to gather as much information as possible and to present it in the most
from all groups of individuals, not groups as in organizations. John.
Precisely.
Yes, if I could add the question, I think the question being raised is a very challenging one, because the people you want to get to in the community are often not part of groups. And we're in a time in our culture where groups are declining. I mean, a lot of congregational groups are no longer as strong as they were, not all, but a number of them are. And so what has to be done, to the questioner's question, how do you get to those folks, is largely what all of us has done, which is to do outreach. Outreach means going out, reaching out, going to places where people are, going to barbershops, going to stores, going to the parks, going to where people are, and then doing very active listening, because we're talking about people who are, for various reasons, alienated from whatever is going on, may not be part of any groups, but the way
we do training to them.
Outreach, yeah.
We actually give free training to community members on organizing and outreach and political education. We offer those services free to community members, but we also are a consulting group. All of us anti-racism consulting and training, because I've been doing anti-racism work for quite some time now. And am able to offer that service. So if you want to know how to be better at reaching community members, if you're looking for a training or workshop about what it means to be grassroots organizing and reach out directly to the people, we can offer that service for a fee.
There you go.
I mean, I just want to make one comment that goes back to the earlier thing I said, and I think Reverend Rigsby comes from that same position too. From a statistical perspective, right? If we look at the numbers mentioned for the 13 demands, 800 to 900, and I'm rounding off, about almost 200 people participating in the community conversations, and I think Dr. McLean and Warden, you're someplace around 744 plus, between 700 and 800, let's say, on the surveys. So those numbers are very respectable numbers, and this is a comment primarily to the City Council, that as you see the recommendations and the 13 demands coming out in the final documentation, right, I think we should be all confident that with those kinds of numbers, that's been fairly significant representation in the city.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I know we're coming up on 3 o'clock, so I don't know if anyone has any further questions or comments specific to the 13 demands. And I can send you all have in the email the full 13 demands. Again, my apologies that I missed that one slide with those 2 numbers.
Okay. That's good.
And to further see any of the conversations that were had that, we have posted about, you can check Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We have live streamed literally everything that we've done in any format, protest, quote unquote, community conversation, like any.
Not political ed though.
Well,
we don't live stream political ed. You have to sign up.
Yeah,
for that.
we do certain Zoom calls that we don't broadcast, but we have records of those happening as well. And so on and so forth. Everything that we've done has been public for the reason of transparency and inclusion. If people see something that represents them, they'll see it. If people see something that doesn't represent them, they'll still see it. And we will make sure that we have the receipts on everything that we've done so that the community knows what's happening, because it's the community that's doing it.
Well,
Okay,
I don't know if we're at the end of that or.
For their presentation and the time they put into this. Again, the Finn Institute report, I think everybody has that to look that over, to read it. So be the topic of discussion, next week. And Chief Clifford, do you have anything else to bring up for today?
Yes, Mayor, thank you. I'd like to thank Michaela and Jamaica for this presentation. I do appreciate this discussion. I am the one that requested it, so I do appreciate your time here to talk to us about your organization, to help us learn more about it, and to have this dialogue. I think this dialogue is very important to what we're here to do. Jamaica, you mentioned why there are so many police officers on this call. And they're on this call because what we're here to talk about and to discuss is important to them. We've been, for the most part, listening to the conversations, engaging when asked, and learning, and we're trying to learn more about what we're here to do, which is to talk about policing and the intersection of policing with systemic racism. And the best way that we can do that is to have conversations and learn more about it. So if I'm going to end in today's meeting with a call to action, I would ask that those leaders in public safety in the criminal justice system, and many of us are on this call right now, are invited to engage in these conversations as they move forward, because that's the only way we're going to learn. We're going to learn more about the system that we're all working in or living in, and what we need to do to improve moving forward. So thank you for it. I appreciate it. Commissioner Devine is on the call. Commissioner, did you want to say anything before we?
Just Chief Clifford, I appreciate you saying that. And I'd be welcome to have a conversation with you about how the police department could go through an anti-racism training.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner? You're on mute, Commissioner. Can you unmute? Now we're muted.
Sorry,
we're
I'm
muted.
on mute.
Okay.
Go ahead, Commissioner, you're live, sir. Okay, good. I just wanted to say, from my perspective, having come in a little bit from the outside and on the tail end of this, although I did see it in my prior occupation, I appreciate all the work that you guys have put in, Michaela and Jamaica, and I think that a lot of your comments have substance. And I just want to say that there are certain things, and now I'm reverting to that legal perspective. We're here to see what we can do in the city of Schenectady, and I'm not sure you have a broader view, and your broader view includes prisons and I think juvenile detention and jails, and those are things that this body has no jurisdiction over. And we can be advocates, as you suggest, but there's certain things that we may just not be able, we just may not have the power to do. And, you know, there aren't that many, but I did want to mention that from a legal perspective, we may be somewhat limited. I think that there's a lot here for us to work with. And I think that my impression of this police department is that willing to listen and willing to change. And, you know, I just got to briefly digress for a second. I started right out of college with the public defender's office, and it was something that I loved, and I did it for 20 some odd years. And I always felt that you could talk about court reform and you could talk about a lot of other things, but that true reform was going to happen at the street level. And this is where I now think we're starting to see it. And I'm, for one, am leaving this meeting with a very optimistic view of where we can go. And I hope you are too. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Anyone else? Final words? Okay, thank you, everybody. Everybody has their homework assignment. So please read the report, send questions that you might have to us, and we'll see you on next Wednesday to discuss the report. Thank you very much.
Enjoy your afternoon.
Mike Gerasi.
Has
Thank you,
left the
everyone. Take
meeting.
care. Stay safe.